The station was almost empty when the evening train slowed to a stop, its iron wheels sighing against the tracks. Dust swirled in the fading light, carrying the smell of coal and dry grass across the wooden platform. A single figure stood near a stack of weathered crates, her suitcase resting at her feet. Her dress, though carefully pressed, showed the wrinkles of a long journey. She held her hands tightly together as if she could squeeze away the cold that wasn't really in the air. The chill came from something deeper being left behind. Travelers stepped down, greeted relatives, collected parcels, and drifted away. But she stayed in place, eyes lowered, as if standing still might keep the truth from settling in. The man who promised to meet her had not arrived. Across the platform, a tall man in a dust-stained coat paused with his hat in his hand. He had come only to collect a small package from the freight car, but the sight of the waiting woman caught him in a way he did not expect. He noticed the suitcase first, scuffed and heavy, and then her face, pale with fatigue but soft with something that pulled at him. He had spent many evenings alone on his small ranch, nursing the quiet ache of a house too silent. His wife had been gone for 3 years now, taken by illness that no doctor could name, and the land had grown lonelier with each passing season. He worked hard from sunrise to dark, yet work no longer filled the emptiness. He was not a man who often stared, but something about the way she stood made him slow his steps. The station agent called his name for the package, but he barely heard. He thought of how a person looks when hope begins to slide away. He had seen that look in the mirror on long winter nights. He knew the weight of waiting for someone who never comes. The young woman shifted her suitcase and glanced toward the horizon where the tracks stretched into endless prairie. A flicker of worry passed across her eyes. Her letter had been clear. He was supposed to be here. She had crossed miles of dust and scrub, leaving behind everything familiar, believing she was walking toward a future. The man who invited her to this place had written kind words and promised a home. Yet the platform remained empty, except for the few who were already turning toward supper and warm lamps. The rancher's boots scuffed the planks as he walked closer, still unsure what he might say. He told himself it was none of his business. But her shoulders sagged slightly when another rider passed without stopping, and that small movement reached him more than words could. He stopped a few feet away and tipped his hat. "Evening," he said, his voice low and careful. She looked up startled, then managed a polite nod. Her eyes were a deep brown, wide with the effort of holding back fear. "Train running late for someone?" he asked, though he already guessed the answer. She hesitated, then shook her head. "No," she said softly. I was supposed to meet someone. He isn't coming." The words trembled like a thin wire in the wind. The man felt a tug inside his chest, a memory of his own empty mornings when the house smelled only of cold ashes. He wanted to tell her she deserved better than a man who would leave her standing in the dust, but he kept his words gentle. "That's a hard thing," he said. "You've been traveling far." "All the way from Kansas City," she replied, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "He wrote that he needed a wife to help with his homestead." Her voice grew smaller. "When he saw me step off the train," he said, "I wasn't what he expected." She looked down at her shoes, the leather scuffed from days on the rail. The rancher clenched his jaw, anger flickering like heat in dry grass. He looked at her dress, plain but neat, and at the way she held herself despite the hurt. She was not what he expected either, but not in the way that man had meant. There was strength in her quiet posture, a dignity that shone through the dust on her hem. Behind them, the station doors banged shut as the agent locked up for the night. The sky deepened to a dusky rose, streaked with the last light of day. The rancher realized she might have nowhere to go once darkness fell. His own home was miles away, a small house with an empty chair at the table and rooms that echoed with silence. He had not planned on company, certainly not on this day. Yet standing here, with the train pulling away and the prairie wind rising, he felt the edges of his life begin to shift. He took a breath, the kind a man takes before stepping into something unknown. "Miss," he said, steady but warm, "the night air can turn sharp out here. You shouldn't be left alone." She looked at him again, studying the lines of his face, the wear of his coat, the kindness that he could not quite hide. Her eyes searched for some reason to trust a stranger. The sound of the departing train faded into the open land, leaving only the whisper of grass and the creak of the station sign. The rancher waited, his heart beating with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. Something about this evening, about this meeting on a lonely platform, carried the promise of a story neither of them could yet name. The wind shifted across the empty platform, carrying the smell of iron rails and dry prairie grass. Evening settled in slow layers of fading gold and deepening violet, the kind of light that stretches shadows and quiets every sound except the low hum of insects. The widower, his name was Samuel though few called him anything but Sam, watched the young woman for a long breath before speaking again. She stood beside her suitcase, shoulders squared though her eyes betrayed a tired sadness. Her posture reminded him of a fence post after a long storm, upright, but weathered by forces it never invited. Sam cleared his throat and tried to soften the roughness of his voice. "My name's Samuel Cooper," he said, tipping his hat in a gesture that felt strangely formal after years of solitary life. "I've got a ranch a few miles west. Could I help you find a place to stay for the night?" The woman hesitated. Her hands tightened around the handle of her suitcase, the leather worn from miles of travel. I don't know," she answered quietly. "I'm supposed to meet someone, but he isn't here." Her eyes flicked to the empty tracks as if hoping a new train might appear and erase the truth. Sam nodded slowly, careful not to crowd her. "It's getting dark. There's a boarding house in town, safer than waiting here." He paused, gauging the fear behind her polite distance. "If you'd like, I can walk you there, just to be sure you reach it safe." The woman studied him for a long moment, as though weighing not just his words but the quiet steadiness behind them. Finally she gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said. Her voice carried both caution and a faint note of relief. "My name is Clara." They walked toward the edge of the platform, the boards creaking under their steps. Sam kept a respectful distance, matching his pace to hers. The air cooled as the last of the sun slid beneath the horizon, and the first stars began to show against the darkening sky. Clara's dress rustled softly with each step, a sound that struck Sam as both fragile and determined. As they reached the dusty street that led toward town, Sam tried to lighten the silence. "Where have you come from, Miss Clara?" he asked gently. "Kansas City," she replied, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I answered an advertisement for a homestead wife. He wrote kind letters, promised a home and a future. I thought," she broke off, swallowing the rest of the thought like a stone. "But when he saw me, he said I wasn't what he expected." Sam felt a tightening in his chest. The cruelty of such a dismissal, spoken to a woman who had crossed half a country on faith, stirred a quiet anger. He chose his words carefully. "That man's expectations sound small," he said. "Too small to see what matters." Clara gave a faint, weary smile, the first hint of warmth he had seen in her expression. "He said I was too large," she admitted after a pause. "Too heavy for a farmer's wife. His letters never asked about weight, but that's all he saw when I stepped off the train." The words hung between them like a cold wind. Sam had no ready reply, only a deepening respect for the courage it took to speak them. He glanced at her, at the strong lines of her shoulders, the quiet dignity in her stride, and wondered how any man could reduce her to a number on a scale. They reached the dim glow of the town's single street lamp. The boarding house stood at the far end, its windows flickering with lamplight. Sam gestured toward it but did not move closer. "That's the place," he said softly. "Mrs. Porter runs it. Good woman. She'll give you a room." Clara stopped, her suitcase still in hand. The warm light painted her face in soft tones, revealing a strength that had carried her through miles of uncertainty. Yet her eyes held a question that reached deeper than a simple night's lodging. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You don't know me." Sam met her gaze without hesitation. "Because no one should be left alone after a journey like yours," he said. "Because I know what it feels like to stand with nowhere to go." He hesitated, the memory of his late wife flickering across his mind. "And because you deserve kindness." For a moment she said nothing, only searched his face as though testing the weight of his words. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're kind." They entered the boarding house together. Warmth greeted them in a rush of lamplight and the faint aroma of stew lingering from the evening meal. Mrs. Porter, a stout woman with keen eyes, looked up from her ledger and smiled in welcome. "Evening, Samuel," she said, then turned her attention to Clara. "And who might this young lady be?" Sam introduced Clara and explained in the simplest terms that she needed a room for the night. Mrs. Porter nodded without question, her glance softening when she saw the weariness in Clara's posture. "You're safe here," she said kindly. "Come in, child. Let's get you settled." As Clara followed Mrs. Porter up the narrow staircase, she turned back to Sam with a small, uncertain smile. "Will I see you again?" she asked quietly. "If you'd like," Sam replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "I'll come by in the morning, just to be sure you're all right." Her smile widened a fraction, enough to light her eyes. "I'd like that," she said, then disappeared up the stairs. Sam remained in the small entryway, hat in hand, staring at the worn carpet where she had stood. Something about the brief exchange stirred a warmth he had not felt since before his wife's passing. He stepped back into the cool night, the door closing softly behind him. The walk back to his ranch felt different than the walk into town. The prairie stretched wide and silent beneath a sky scattered with stars. Sam thought of Clara's steady voice, of the quiet courage it took for her to leave everything behind in search of a future. He thought of the man who had dismissed her with a single cruel word, and anger tightened his grip on the reins of his horse. Yet beneath the anger was something else, a growing sense of possibility that quickened his steps despite the long road ahead. At the ranch, the familiar creak of the gate greeted him like an old friend. The house stood in shadow, its windows dark, but tonight the emptiness felt less heavy. He lit a lamp and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the flame as it flickered across the worn wood. He pictured Clara's face, the way she had lifted her chin despite the hurt, and the way her eyes had softened when he offered simple kindness. Sleep came late, but when it did, it carried dreams of a new morning. Sam awoke before dawn, the eastern sky just beginning to pale. As he saddled his horse, he felt a quiet urgency pressing against the edges of his thoughts. Something about yesterday's meeting refused to settle into the past. He told himself he was only keeping a promise to check on her, but the truth ran deeper. There was a pull in his chest, a sense that their lives had brushed against each other for a reason neither could yet name. The ride into town was crisp with the scent of dew and the promise of sunrise. Birds stirred in the cottonwoods as the first light touched the roofs of the small settlement. Sam dismounted in front of the boarding house just as Mrs. Porter opened the door to sweep the porch. She looked up with a knowing smile. "You're back early, Samuel," she said, leaning on her broom. "The young lady is awake. She's been waiting." Sam felt a flicker of surprise but also a quiet satisfaction. He removed his hat and stepped inside, his heart beating with the slow, steady rhythm of a man who senses that something important is beginning. Upstairs, he heard the creak of floorboards as Clara descended. She wore the same dress as the night before, freshly brushed and neat, her hair pulled back with simple care. When she saw him, her face lit with a small, genuine smile. "You came," she said softly. "I said I would," Sam replied, his own smile answering hers. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," she admitted. "It's been a long time since I felt safe." They sat at a small table near the window, the morning light spilling across the polished wood. Sam ordered coffee for them both, the rich aroma filling the quiet room. They spoke in low voices, sharing small pieces of their lives. Clara told him about her childhood on a modest farm, about the loneliness that had pushed her to answer a stranger's advertisement. Sam listened intently, offering small questions but never pity. In turn, he shared fragments of his own story, the years of ranch work, the loss of his wife, the quiet that had filled his days ever since. As the conversation deepened, a gentle understanding grew between them. Each had known loss. Each had faced long nights of solitude, and each carried a strength forged in the fires of disappointment. There was no need for grand declarations. Their shared silences spoke louder than any words, weaving a fragile but undeniable connection across the table as the morning sun climbed higher. The morning light streamed through the small boarding house window, casting a soft glow across the polished wooden floor where Samuel and Clara sat. Outside, the town stirred awake with the slow rhythm of a prairie settlement. Wagon wheels creaked on the dusty street, roosters called in distant backyards, and the faint clink of a blacksmith's hammer echoed against the rising sun. Inside, time seemed to slow around their quiet conversation. Clara cupped the warm coffee mug between her hands, savoring the comfort of its heat. Samuel watched her with a calm attentiveness, noticing the way the morning light traced the gentle curve of her cheek and the strength hidden in her posture. She carried herself like someone who had been hurt but refused to let the hurt define her. They spoke of ordinary things at first. Samuel told her about the ranch, the wide fields, the stubborn cattle, the windmills that creaked on nights when storms gathered over the horizon. Clara listened intently, her eyes following the movement of his hands as he described the open land. She asked about the work, about the long winters and the dry summers, about the challenges of keeping a ranch alive when markets were unpredictable and weather could turn cruel. Her questions were thoughtful and precise, revealing a mind as practical as it was curious. Samuel felt a quiet pleasure in answering them, grateful for the chance to share a piece of his world with someone who truly listened. Clara, in turn, spoke of the life she had left behind. She described the small boarding room she once rented near the edge of Kansas City, the endless hours spent sewing for other people's families, and the loneliness that followed her through crowded streets. She explained how she had answered the advertisement from a man she had never met, driven by a hope for companionship and a place to belong. Her voice remained steady, but Samuel heard the weight behind each word, the courage it had taken to board a train alone, the heartbreak of arriving to find nothing but rejection. He marveled at her honesty. She did not dress her story in self-pity. She presented it as plain fact, trusting him to understand the quiet bravery it revealed. When their breakfast plates were cleared and the room emptied of other guests, Samuel leaned back in his chair and studied Clara more closely. He saw the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the strong shape of her shoulders, the way she held his gaze without flinching. She was not a woman broken by cruelty. She was a woman tempered by it, as strong and enduring as the prairie itself. He thought of the man who had judged her unworthy and felt a surge of anger he quickly swallowed. There was no need to speak it. The truth of her worth was written in every quiet gesture she made. A clock on the wall marked the passing minutes, each tick a reminder that choices waited beyond this morning. Samuel felt the weight of an unspoken question pressing between them. He had lived in the shadow of grief for years, burying himself in work and silence. He had not imagined meeting someone who could awaken the part of him that still longed for companionship. Yet here she was, sitting across from him with calm eyes and a story that touched something deep inside him. He wondered if she sensed the same pull, the same quiet recognition that life was offering them an unexpected second chance. Clara set down her empty mug and looked out the window. The street beyond the glass was beginning to fill with movement, merchants opening shop doors, children darting between wagons, travelers stepping off the morning train. She spoke without turning her head. "I don't know where to go now," she admitted. "I left everything behind. I thought I was starting a new life, but I have no plan past this station." Samuel felt a rush of protectiveness that startled him with its strength. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "You don't have to decide today," he said gently. "You're safe here for as long as you need." Clara turned back to face him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied his expression. "Why are you so kind to me?" she asked. "We only met yesterday." He held her gaze, letting the silence stretch before answering. Because I know what it feels like to lose something you can't replace, he said finally. Because I've seen loneliness up close. And because sometimes life puts two people in the same place for a reason, even if they don't know what that reason is yet. Clara's eyes softened. A faint smile touched her lips, fragile but genuine. That sounds almost like faith, she said. Maybe it is, Samuel replied with a quiet shrug. Maybe it's just the way the world works when we stop trying to fight it. They left the boarding house together a short while later, stepping into a day already warming beneath the wide blue sky. Samuel offered to show Clara the town, and she accepted with a small nod. They walked along the main street, past the blacksmith's forge and the modest general store, their footsteps raising small puffs of dust with each step. People glanced their way, curious about the unfamiliar woman beside the widowed rancher. Some nodded politely, others offered cautious smiles. Clara returned each greeting with quiet dignity, her chin lifted in a way that told the world she would not be defined by yesterday's rejection. At the livery stable, Samuel introduced her to his horse, a calm chestnut mare with intelligent eyes. Clara reached out and stroked the animal's neck, her touch gentle and sure. The mare nickered softly, leaning into her hand. She likes you, Samuel observed with a grin. I've always liked animals, Clara replied, her smile widening. They judge less than people do. They continued their walk to the edge of town where the prairie stretched wide and unbroken, the tall grasses swaying in the breeze like an endless sea. Samuel stopped and gestured toward the horizon. My ranch is out there, he said. It isn't much, but it's honest land. Hard work, plenty of sky, a place where a person can breathe. Clara followed his gaze, her eyes tracing the distant hills. It sounds beautiful, she said softly, and lonely. It was, Samuel admitted, until yesterday. The words hung in the air, quiet but full of meaning. Clara turned to look at him, surprise flickering across her face. Samuel met her eyes without flinching, letting the truth of his statement settle between them. He wasn't a man for fancy speeches, but he knew when something mattered enough to speak plainly. They lingered at the edge of the prairie, neither rushing the silence. The wind carried the scent of sun-warmed grass and the faint cry of a hawk circling high above. Samuel thought of his empty house, of the chair across from his own at the kitchen table, of the long nights when only the ticking clock kept him company. He imagined Clara there instead, her presence filling the quiet spaces with warmth and steady conversation. The image felt so natural it startled him. As they began the slow walk back toward town, Samuel found himself sharing more of his life than he had with anyone in years. He told Clara about his late wife, how they had built the ranch together, how illness had taken her too soon, how he had buried himself in work to keep from drowning in grief. Clara listened without interruption, her eyes steady and kind. When he finished, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I'm sorry," she said simply. The sincerity in her voice cut through years of silence, easing a wound he had thought would never heal. They reached the boarding house as the afternoon sun tilted toward evening. Samuel held the door for Clara, his mind racing with thoughts he could barely name. He knew that what he felt was more than sympathy. It was a pull toward something larger, something that carried both risk and possibility. He wondered if she felt it too, the quiet recognition that two lives, scarred by loss and disappointment, might yet find solace in each other. Clara paused on the threshold, her suitcase still waiting near the stairs where she had left it that morning. She looked back at Samuel, her eyes searching his face. "You've been very kind," she said softly. "More than I expected from a stranger." "Maybe we're not strangers anymore," he replied, his voice low but certain. The corner of her mouth lifted in a shy smile, and for the first time since they met, Samuel saw a spark of hope flicker in her expression. It was small, but it was enough to make his heart quicken with a new, unfamiliar anticipation. The day that had begun with loneliness was unfolding into something he could not yet name, but no longer wished to deny. The late afternoon sun slanted low across the prairie, casting long amber streaks over the dusty street, and painting the sky in layers of rose and pale gold. Samuel stood outside the boarding house, hat in hand, feeling the weight of a decision he had not planned to make. He had come that morning only to keep a promise, to check on a woman who had been left behind by another man's cruelty. Yet every word they had exchanged since dawn seemed to tighten an invisible thread between them. He felt it now as he waited for Clara to join him for a walk. It was not the nervous excitement of youth, but something steadier and more profound. A recognition that life might be offering a second chance if he dared to reach for it. Clara stepped through the doorway carrying her small suitcase, the same worn bag that had traveled miles across the country and through the storm of rejection. The evening light caught the gentle lines of her face and set a soft glow in her brown eyes. Samuel noticed how she carried herself, neither defeated nor hurried, simply present with a quiet strength that commanded respect. She had dressed carefully, smoothing the folds of her faded dress and tying her hair back in a simple knot. There was no attempt to disguise the journey's weariness, only the honest dignity of a woman who refused to hide her true self. "You came back," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that steadied the restless thoughts in his mind. "I told you I would," Samuel replied, offering a small smile. "Would you care for a walk before the evening meal? The air is fine out toward the ridge." Clara hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded. "I'd like that." They walked side by side along the quiet street, their footsteps raising small clouds of dust that shimmered in the golden light. Merchants were closing their doors for the day, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the bakery as the last loaves cooled on wooden racks. Children played near the well, their laughter rising like a bright counterpoint to the slow creak of wagon wheels heading home. Samuel offered a polite greeting to the townsfolk they passed, but his attention remained on the woman beside him. Every small gesture, her careful steps, the way she glanced at the sky as if measuring the coming night, felt significant, as though each detail was part of a story still unfolding. When they reached the edge of town, the land opened into a sweep of prairie that stretched to the horizon. Tall grasses bent in a soft wind that carried the scent of warm earth and distant wildflowers. Samuel paused to let Clara take in the view. "This is the country I call home," he said quietly. "My ranch is just beyond those hills." Clara followed his gaze, her eyes tracing the endless expanse. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice filled with something that sounded like wonder. "So much space, so much sky." "It can feel lonely," Samuel admitted, "but it also gives a person room to breathe. Out there, a body can find peace if they're willing to work for it." Clara smiled faintly. "I've never been afraid of work," she said. "I only feared working my whole life without anyone to share it with." Her words settled between them like the first stars appearing in the twilight. Samuel felt their truth echo through his own heart. He had worked through grief and solitude for years, surviving but not truly living. Here, beside this woman who had crossed states for a promise that turned to dust, he sensed the possibility of something more than survival. They continued toward a low ridge where the land dipped into a shallow valley. As they walked, Samuel began to share pieces of his life he rarely spoke aloud. He told her about the early days on the ranch, how he and his late wife had struggled against drought and blizzard to carve a home from the wild land. He described the quiet after she passed, the way the house seemed to echo with her absence, and the long nights when only the ticking of the clock kept him company. Clara listened with a stillness that felt like understanding rather than pity. When he faltered, searching for the right words, she reached out and laid a gentle hand on his sleeve. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Losing someone you love never leaves you the same." Samuel looked at her hand resting against his coat and felt a warmth spread through the cold corners of his heart. "You speak as if you know," he said. Clara nodded slowly. "I lost my mother when I was young. My father worked the rails, gone for weeks at a time. I learned early how to carry loss and keep moving." They walked in thoughtful silence, the prairie wind weaving around them like a quiet hymn. Samuel found comfort in the shared understanding of loss, but also in the strength she carried despite it. He realized he was not speaking to a stranger, but to someone whose heart had been tempered by the same hard lessons that had shaped his own. When they reached the ridge, the sun hovered low over the horizon, spilling crimson and gold across the sky. The light bathed Clara's face in a glow that made Samuel catch his breath. She looked out over the rolling land, her eyes reflecting the fire of the sunset. "It feels like the world goes on forever," she murmured. "It does," Samuel replied, "and it's waiting for folks who are brave enough to start again." Clara turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you really believe a person can start again after everything?" "I do," he said, his voice steady. "I believe it because I have to, and because sometimes a new beginning shows up when you least expect it." The words hung between them, charged with a meaning neither dared to speak outright. Samuel felt the weight of the moment pressing gently on his chest. He wanted to tell her that he saw her courage, that he admired the way she carried herself despite the cruelty she had faced. He wanted to tell her that her presence had stirred something in him he thought was buried with his wife. But he also knew that words spoken too quickly might scare away the fragile trust they were building. As twilight deepened, they began the walk back toward town. The first stars emerged one by one, flickering above the wide horizon. Clara asked about the daily life on the ranch, how many cattle he kept, how far the fences stretched, what chores filled the long days. Samuel answered each question with quiet pride, describing the work in simple terms that made the land come alive. He could see her imagining the wide pastures, the morning rides, the steady rhythm of a life built on honest effort. When they reached the outskirts of town, the boarding house lanterns glowed softly in the gathering dark. Samuel slowed his pace, reluctant to end the walk. Clara seemed to feel it too, for she lingered beside him, her suitcase swinging lightly at her side. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," she said quietly, "but today has been better than I could have hoped." Samuel turned to face her, his heart beating with a quiet urgency. "Sometimes tomorrow depends on the choices we make today," he said. Clara met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. The wind lifted a strand of hair from her cheek, and Samuel resisted the impulse to reach out and smooth it back. Instead, he held her eyes and let the silence speak for him. He saw a flicker of recognition in her expression, a softening that told him she understood what he could not yet put into words. They stepped onto the wooden porch of the boarding house as the town settled into night. The creak of the boards beneath their feet felt like the closing of one chapter and the hesitant beginning of another. Samuel opened the door and held it for her, his hand lingering on the frame as she stepped inside. She turned back, her face lit by the warm glow of the hallway lamp. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for everything today." "There's nothing to thank," Samuel replied gently. "I'm only glad I was here." For a long moment they stood there, the quiet of the evening wrapping around them like a soft blanket. Samuel felt the pull of something deeper than friendship, a current of connection strong enough to carry them both into a future neither had planned. He did not know what tomorrow would demand, but he knew that the path ahead, whatever it held, would not feel as lonely as the road that had brought him here. The next morning broke clear and bright, the prairie sky stretching wide and endless above the little town. Samuel rose before sunrise, stirred by a restless energy that refused to let him linger in bed. He saddled his horse in the crisp dawn air, the leather creaking softly under his practiced hands, and rode toward the boarding house with a heart that beat faster than the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. He told himself he was simply checking on Clara as he had promised, but deep inside he knew the truth was larger. Something had shifted between them during their walk the night before, something that would not be satisfied by a polite farewell. When he arrived, the boarding house door stood open to welcome the day. The scent of fresh biscuits drifted out to meet him, warm and inviting. Mrs. Porter greeted him with a knowing smile that made him straighten his shoulders like a boy caught sneaking sweets. "Good morning, Samuel," she said. "Your friend is finishing her breakfast. She'll be glad to see you." Samuel removed his hat and stepped inside, the wooden floor cool beneath his boots. Clara sat at a small table near the window, the morning light turning her chestnut hair into a halo of burnished gold. She looked up as he entered, and the smile that spread across her face was quiet but unmistakable. It reached her eyes in a way that made his chest tighten. "You're up early," she said, her voice carrying a gentle warmth. "Habit of ranch life," Samuel replied, pulling out a chair across from her. "But I admit I wanted to see how you fared after yesterday." "I slept well," Clara said, folding her hands neatly on the table. "Better than I have in weeks." She paused, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. "Your kindness made a difference." Samuel felt a rush of emotion that surprised him. He cleared his throat and reached for the coffee pot, pouring a steaming cup while he searched for the right words. "I'm glad," he said finally. "No one should face such a journey alone." They shared breakfast in companionable silence, the simple meal of biscuits and eggs tasting richer for the company. Samuel watched the way Clara's eyes softened when she laughed at Mrs. Porter's gentle teasing, the way her fingers traced idle patterns on the rim of her cup. Each small gesture etched itself into his memory like the steady carving of initials into weathered wood. After the meal, Samuel suggested a walk through the marketplace that had sprung to life along the main street. Clara agreed, and they stepped into the fresh morning air together. The town bustled with the sounds of daily life, merchants calling out their wares, children chasing each other in playful circles, the distant whistle of a train arriving from the east. Clara moved among the crowd with quiet grace, her eyes wide as she took in the colorful displays of fabric, tools, and fresh produce. Samuel noticed how easily people warmed to her presence. Shopkeepers greeted her with polite smiles, and children peered at her curiously before offering shy waves. Clara returned each greeting with a nod or a soft word, carrying herself with a dignity that seemed to disarm even the most suspicious onlooker. They stopped at a stall selling hand-woven blankets, the vibrant patterns catching the light like captured pieces of the prairie sky. Clara ran her fingers over the fabric, admiring the craftsmanship. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "Would you like one?" Samuel asked. Clara shook her head with a small smile. "Not today, but it's kind of you to offer." Her refusal was gentle but firm, a reminder of the independence that defined her. Samuel respected it, though a part of him longed to give her something tangible, a token of the growing affection he struggled to name. As the morning wore on, they wandered to the edge of town where the open land began once more. Samuel pointed out the distant hills that marked the boundary of his ranch, describing the work that filled his days, the calving in spring, the harvest of hay, the endless repairs to fences and wells. Clara listened with quiet interest, asking thoughtful questions about the life he led. Her curiosity was not idle. It carried the weight of someone imagining herself within the world he described. Samuel felt it in the way her eyes lingered on the horizon, in the slight tightening of her grip on the handle of her small suitcase. They sat on a low stone wall overlooking the prairie, the breeze carrying the sweet scent of blooming wildflowers. Clara rested her suitcase beside her and looked out across the endless sea of grass. "It's so different from the city," she said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and uncertainty. "There's nothing to hide behind out here, only sky and land." "That's true," Samuel replied. "The land asks for honesty. It shows a person who they really are." Clara turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "And who are you, Samuel Cooper?" she asked with a faint smile. He met her gaze steadily. "A man who works hard, a man who lost more than he thought he could bear, and a man who believes life isn't finished with him yet." Her smile deepened, softening the guarded lines of her face. "I think you might be right," she said quietly. For a long time they sat together, the silence between them filled with the sound of rustling grass and distant bird calls. Samuel felt a calm certainty settle over him, the kind that comes when a person recognizes a truth they can no longer ignore. He had known Clara for only a brief span of days, yet her presence had already reshaped the contours of his heart. He no longer saw her as a stranger left behind by someone else's cruelty. He saw her as a partner in resilience, a woman whose strength matched his own, whose quiet dignity called to the deepest parts of his soul. When they returned to town, the sun had climbed high and the streets glowed with midday heat. They stopped at the well to draw cool water, sharing the dipper like old friends. Clara's laughter rang out when a sudden gust of wind lifted her hat and sent it skimming across the street. Samuel retrieved it with an easy grin, brushing dust from the brim before handing it back. The simple exchange felt intimate in a way that surprised them both, a small sign of the bond that had taken root between them. Back at the boarding house, Samuel lingered on the porch while Clara prepared to rest. He wanted to ask her to stay longer, to visit the ranch and see the world he had described in quiet detail. But he held back, sensing that her trust was something to be earned slowly. Instead, he tipped his hat and said, "If you'd like, I can show you the ranch tomorrow. No obligation, just a ride across the land. It might give you a clearer picture of this country." Clara studied him for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. Then she gave a small, deliberate nod. "I would like that," she said. "Very much." The promise of tomorrow hung between them as Samuel mounted his horse and rode back to his ranch. The journey felt shorter than usual, each mile filled with the memory of Clara's quiet smile and the warmth of her presence beside him. He thought of the empty rooms waiting at home, the echo of silence that had filled his evenings for years. For the first time in a long while, the thought of returning did not carry its usual weight. Instead, he imagined the sound of Clara's laughter drifting through the halls, the sight of her hands tending to the small garden his late wife had once cherished. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Samuel dismounted at the ranch gate and looked out over the fields. The cattle grazed peacefully in the fading light, their silhouettes dark against the golden grass. He felt the familiar pull of responsibility, the endless tasks that kept the ranch alive. But tonight it was joined by something new, a quiet anticipation that stirred beneath his ribs. Tomorrow he would bring Clara here. Tomorrow she would see the life he had built, the land that shaped him, the home that waited for something more than mere survival. Inside the house, Samuel lit a lamp and sat at the kitchen table, the flame casting warm shadows on the worn wood. He thought of the girl who had crossed miles of railroad tracks for a man who failed to see her worth. He thought of the courage it took for her to speak her story without bitterness, and of the gentle strength that shone in her every gesture. The memory of her eyes, steady and unafraid, filled the room like the glow of the lamp. Night settled softly over the prairie, bringing with it a hush that Samuel had long known as loneliness. But tonight the silence carried a different sound. A quiet expectancy, like the pause before a new chapter begins. He could feel it in the creak of the floorboards, in the steady beat of his own heart, in the faint scent of wildflowers carried on the night breeze. Something was changing, and though he could not yet see its full shape, he knew with certainty that tomorrow would bring more than the usual work of mending fences and feeding cattle. It would bring Clara to the ranch, and with her, the possibility of a life he had almost stopped believing could ever be his again. The next morning dawned with a gentle warmth that promised a perfect day for a ride across the prairie. Samuel rose early, his mind already alive with thoughts of Clara seeing the ranch for the first time. He moved through his chores with a quiet urgency, feeding the cattle, checking the water troughs, and saddling the mare with careful hands. The sun was only a pale glow along the eastern ridge when he finished, yet his heart beat with the steady excitement of a man who sensed something important waiting just beyond the horizon. He dressed with more care than usual, brushing the dust from his coat and making sure his boots carried a polish that spoke of quiet respect. By the time he reached the boarding house, the town was beginning to stir. Merchants opened shutters, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. Samuel dismounted and tied the mare to the post outside, his eyes scanning the doorway. Clara stepped out just as the bell of the small church down the street struck 8. She wore the same travel dress she had arrived in, freshly brushed and neat, her hair gathered in a tidy braid that gleamed in the morning light. The sight of her sent a warmth through him that no prairie sun could match. "Good morning," she greeted, her voice soft but sure. "Morning, Miss Clara," Samuel replied, tipping his hat with a smile that came easier than it had in years. "Ready to see a bit of open country?" "I've been ready since you mentioned it yesterday," she said, her eyes bright with a mixture of excitement and calm determination. Samuel helped her onto the mare, then swung into the saddle behind her. They rode out of town at an easy pace, the dusty street giving way to wide stretches of grassland that shimmered under the rising sun. Clara sat straight in the saddle, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon as the wind tugged gently at her braid. Samuel guided the horse along a path worn by years of travel, pointing out landmarks as they went. A lone cottonwood tree that marked a hidden spring, a cluster of rocks where hawks often nested, the distant ridge where his cattle grazed. As the town faded behind them, the silence of the open prairie wrapped around them like a vast, gentle embrace. Clara breathed deeply, her face softening as the scent of wild sage and sun-warmed grass filled the air. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," she said quietly. "I can see why you love it here." "It can be harsh," Samuel admitted. "The winters bite hard and the summers test a person's grit. But it's honest land. It gives back what you put into it, and it never pretends to be anything it's not." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "I think I prefer honesty, even when it's hard." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of the horse's hooves blending with the soft whistle of the wind. Samuel stole glances at Clara, noting the way her eyes followed the curve of the hills and the distant shimmer of the creek. There was no sign of fear in her expression, only quiet wonder and a growing familiarity, as though she already belonged to the landscape. When they reached the crest of a gentle slope, Samuel drew the reins and slowed the mare to a stop. Below them lay the heart of his ranch, wide fields dotted with grazing cattle, a weathered barn standing sturdy against the breeze, and a modest house whose porch faced the endless sky. The morning light bathed the land in shades of gold and green, making it look like a painting come alive. "This is home," Samuel said, his voice carrying a note of pride he hadn't felt in years. "It isn't grand, but it's mine." Clara took in the view, her eyes shining as she traced the lines of the fence, the glint of the creek, the gentle movement of cattle in the pasture. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Not because it's grand, but because it's real." Her words settled deep in Samuel's chest. For so long he had carried the ranch as a burden, a daily fight against weather, debt, and loneliness. Now, hearing her speak with such quiet reverence, he saw it anew, not as a weight, but as a promise of life waiting to be shared. They rode down toward the house, the mare picking her way carefully along the narrow path. Samuel dismounted first and helped Clara to the ground, his hands steady at her waist. For a heartbeat they stood close, the warmth of her presence sparking a quiet current between them. He stepped back reluctantly and led her toward the porch. Inside, the house carried the clean scent of wood and sunlight. Clara paused in the doorway, taking in the simple furnishings. A sturdy table, shelves lined with well-worn books, a stone hearth blackened by years of winter fires. "It feels lived in," she said, her voice tinged with something like affection. "Like it has stories to tell." "It does," Samuel replied, watching her move through the room. "Every board and nail has a memory. My late wife and I built much of it together. After she passed, I kept it standing, but it hasn't felt like a home in a long time." Clara turned to face him, her eyes gentle. "It feels like a home to me," she said quietly. The simplicity of her words struck him harder than any grand declaration. He felt the weight of years of solitude pressing against the sudden warmth of this moment. He had not invited her here merely as a courtesy. Deep down, he knew he was showing her more than land and timber. He was offering a glimpse of the life he longed to build again. They spent the late morning walking the property. Samuel showed Clara the barn, where the scent of hay mingled with the soft sounds of cattle shifting in their stalls. He explained the rhythms of calving season, the endless repairs needed to keep fences strong, the careful balance of feeding and grazing that kept the herd healthy. Clara listened with sharp attention, asking questions that revealed both intelligence and a willingness to learn. Her curiosity pleased him more than he expected. He could imagine her voice in this space, offering ideas, sharing laughter, turning daily work into shared purpose. When the sun climbed high, Samuel led her to a small grove near the creek where a patch of wildflowers bloomed in riotous color. They sat on a flat stone by the water, sharing a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples he had packed that morning. The air was warm but not oppressive, the breeze carrying the soft murmur of running water and the distant calls of meadowlarks. Clara removed her bonnet and tilted her face to the sun. "I can hear my own heartbeat here," she said with a small smile. "It feels peaceful." Samuel watched the way the light played across her features, softening the lines of travel and heartache. "Peace is rare," he said. "When you find it, you hold on." For a long while they ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crunch of bread and the gentle music of the creek. Samuel found himself imagining what it would be like to share many more meals like this, simple, nourishing, and filled with quiet understanding. He pictured Clara tending a small garden near the house, her laughter mixing with the calls of the birds. The image felt as natural as breathing. After lunch, they returned to the porch and sat in the shade, watching clouds drift lazily across the endless blue. Clara rested her hands in her lap, her gaze sweeping across the fields where the cattle grazed. "It's hard to believe that yesterday I didn't know this place existed," she said softly, "and now it feels important." Samuel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Sometimes the most important things arrive without warning," he said. "Life doesn't always give us time to prepare." Clara turned to meet his eyes, and for a moment neither of them looked away. The quiet between them carried a charge as strong as any spoken word. Samuel felt the pull of a decision rising within him, a certainty that had been building since the moment he first saw her standing alone on the station platform. He had lived through loss, through seasons of relentless solitude, but in Clara, he saw not just companionship but the promise of a future shaped by mutual respect and quiet love. He took a slow breath, steadying his voice. "Clara," he said, "I don't know what plans you had when you left Kansas City, and I won't pretend to know what's in your heart. But I do know this: I would be honored if you'd consider staying. Not as a guest, not as a worker, as my wife." The words hung in the warm air, as fragile and powerful as the first light of dawn. Clara's eyes widened slightly, surprise flashing across her face, followed by a depth of emotion that made Samuel's heart quicken. She looked away for a moment, toward the rolling fields that stretched to the horizon, then back to him. "You hardly know me," she said softly, "and yet you speak as if you do." Samuel met her gaze with quiet conviction. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you are strong, kind, and honest. I know you deserve more than the cruelty you faced. And I know that when I imagine the days ahead, I see you beside me." Clara held his eyes, the wind lifting a strand of hair from her cheek. Slowly a faint smile curved her lips, carrying both wonder and resolve. "You see me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not what others say I should be." "I see you," Samuel confirmed, the words steady and sure. For a long heartbeat they sat in the golden light, the prairie stretching around them like an endless promise. Clara reached out and placed her hand over his, her touch warm and certain. In that simple gesture, Samuel felt the weight of past years begin to lift, replaced by the quiet strength of a new beginning. The afternoon sun lingered over the land as they remained on the porch, hands joined, neither speaking nor needing to. The house behind them, once a place of solitude, now felt alive with the soft hum of possibility. The ranch, the sky, the wide, unbroken prairie, all of it seemed to breathe with the same quiet hope that filled their hearts as the day stretched toward evening, carrying them gently into a future they were only beginning to claim.